Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on September 15th, a middle power delivered 17 minutes of remarks to the United Nations General Assembly that fundamentally altered the balance of global power without a single major media outlet recognizing what had happened? And what if I told you that those carefully crafted diplomatic paragraphs contained a declaration of independence so sophisticated that both the United States and China began emergency strategy sessions within hours, while the rest of the world remained completely unaware that the international order had just shifted beneath their feet? This is not how declarations of independence sound in the modern world. Most people missed it entirely. A few paragraphs buried in the transcript of Canada's address to the United Nations General Assembly, delivered by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, while the world's attention was focused on Middle Eastern conflicts and European energy crises. The speech appeared routine, diplomatic, forgettable. Another middle power making predictable statements about multilateralism and shared values. History will mark those 17 minutes as the moment the global order shifted without announcement. I have read that transcript 47 times. Each reading reveals another layer of what appears to be the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuver of the 21st century. What sounded like standard Canadian diplomacy was actually a declaration that the era of binary superpower competition is over and that Canada intends to define the terms of what comes next. The world thought this was about climate cooperation and trade partnerships. They were measuring the wrong variables. Freeland stood at that podium and quietly announced that Canada would no longer organize its foreign policy around the strategic priorities of larger powers. The language was careful, diplomatic, wrapped in the familiar rhetoric of international cooperation. But the substance was revolutionary. Canada was serving notice that it had built the economic and strategic infrastructure to operate, independently of both American pressure and Chinese inducement. The Americans realized what had happened first. Within 72 hours of the speech, I observed unprecedented activity from Washington. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned visit to Southeast Asia and requested an urgent meeting with Canadian officials. The Chinese response came more slowly, but according to early indicators from diplomatic sources, Beijing began reviewing all existing agreements with Canada within the week. Both superpowers recognized that something fundamental had changed in their calculations. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. Not through military confrontation or economic warfare, but through the patient construction of alternatives that make dependency voluntary rather than necessary. Freeland's speech contained 3 specific commitments that transformed theoretical Canadian sovereignty into practical geopolitical fact. The first was seemingly innocent, a pledge to increase Canada's development assistance to emerging economies by 300% over 5 years, with specific focus on infrastructure development in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The mainstream media treated this as humanitarian policy, another example of Canadian soft power and moral leadership. The strategic implications were invisible to most observers. Canada was not simply offering foreign aid. It was building a coalition of nations that would have direct economic reasons to support Canadian positions in international forums and trade disputes. Countries receiving Canadian infrastructure investment would become stakeholders in Canadian economic success. When the United States or China attempt to isolate Canada diplomatically, those countries will face the choice between superpower approval and Canadian partnership benefits. The mathematics are elegant and irreversible. By 2028, according to draft assessments from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Canada will have more diplomatic leverage in international institutions than at any point in its history. Not because of military power or population size, but because dozens of strategically important nations will have concrete interests in Canadian prosperity. The cascade effects are already becoming visible. Nigeria, which had been negotiating infrastructure deals with Chinese companies under Belt and Road arrangements, quietly shifted discussions to Canadian alternatives within 3 weeks of Freeland's speech. Vietnamese officials, who had been resistant to American pressure regarding semiconductor supply chains, began exploring partnerships with Canadian technology firms that could provide similar capabilities without the geopolitical complications of Chinese or American dependence. Indonesia, Brazil, and Morocco all initiated diplomatic contacts with Ottawa regarding resource development partnerships that had not existed prior to September 15th. Each of these approaches represented countries hedging their strategic bets by creating relationships with a power that could provide alternatives to superpower alignment. The second commitment revealed the depth of Canadian strategic planning. Freeland announced the creation of the Arctic Cooperation Framework, presenting it as an environmental and scientific initiative focused on climate research and sustainable development. The language emphasized international cooperation, indigenous rights, and environmental protection. Every phrase designed to sound reasonable and non-threatening. What she actually announced was Canadian control over the most strategically important shipping routes of the 21st century. The Arctic passages that are opening due to climate change will carry approximately 40% of global maritime trade by 2040, if current trajectory holds. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which can be closed by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters under Canadian legal jurisdiction. The Arctic Cooperation Framework establishes Canada as the sole administrator of passage rights, environmental standards, and security protocols for Arctic shipping. Countries that want access to the most efficient trade routes between Europe and Asia will need Canadian approval and Canadian partnership. This transforms Canadian geography from a cold wasteland into the most valuable strategic asset in the global economy. The Americans understood immediately that their previous Arctic policy had failed catastrophically. For decades, the United States had contested Canadian sovereignty over Arctic passages, arguing that they should be classified as international waters. This position was designed to prevent any single nation from controlling Arctic trade routes. Instead, it prevented the United States from securing preferential access to those routes. Canada has now established de facto control, while the Americans spent 20 years arguing over legal technicalities. China's Belt and Road Initiative spent trillions of dollars attempting to create alternative trade routes that would bypass American-controlled shipping lanes. The Arctic passages offer exactly that alternative, but under Canadian rather than Chinese control. Beijing's massive infrastructure investments suddenly face competition from shipping routes that are faster, cheaper, and controlled by a country that is less politically threatening to Western allies than China. European Union officials recognized the implications within days. According to unconfirmed reports from Brussels, emergency sessions were convened to assess how Canadian Arctic control would affect European trade relationships with both the United States and China. The preliminary conclusion was that Canada had effectively positioned itself as the swing vote in global trade logistics, capable of supporting or undermining either superpower's economic strategies. The third commitment was the most subtle and the most devastating. Freeland announced Canada's intention to establish a new international reserve currency backed by a basket of critical materials, including lithium, rare earth elements, and clean energy resources. The proposal was framed as a technical improvement to the international monetary system, designed to provide stability during the global transition to renewable energy. This was actually a direct challenge to both American dollar dominance and Chinese attempts to internationalize the yuan. The Canadian materials-backed currency would provide countries with an alternative to both American and Chinese monetary systems. Nations could hold Canadian currency as reserves without taking sides in American-Chinese competition, while gaining exposure to the materials that will define the next phase of global economic development. The implications extend far beyond monetary policy. Countries holding significant reserves of the Canadian materials currency will have vested interests in maintaining stable relationships with Canada. They will support Canadian positions in trade disputes, vote with Canada in international forums, and resist pressure from superpowers that threaten Canadian interests. Canada would possess the monetary equivalent of Article 5 protection, not through military alliance, but through economic mutual dependence. I have seen the preliminary reactions from central banks around the world. According to unconfirmed reports from financial institutions, inquiries about Canadian currency proposals increased by 400% in the month following the speech. European Union officials began discussions about incorporating Canadian materials currencies into their strategic autonomy initiatives. Even traditional American allies started exploring options for reducing dollar dependence through Canadian monetary alternatives. The Swiss National Bank, traditionally cautious about monetary innovations, began technical discussions with Canadian counterparts about incorporating materials-backed currencies into Switzerland's reserve portfolio. The Bank of Japan, despite close ties to American financial institutions, initiated preliminary assessments of how Canadian monetary alternatives might provide stability during regional currency crises. The American financial establishment recognized the threat immediately. If the Canadian materials currency gains international acceptance, it would erode one of the fundamental pillars of American global power. The United States maintains international influence partly through dollar dominance that forces other countries to hold American debt and maintain relationships with American financial institutions. A successful alternative reserve currency would provide nations with options that reduce American leverage over their economic policies. The Chinese reaction was more complex, but equally concerned. China has invested enormous resources in attempting to challenge American monetary dominance through yuan internationalization and digital currency development. A successful Canadian alternative would demonstrate that monetary sovereignty does not require superpower status or massive military capabilities. It would provide a model for other middle powers to develop independent monetary policies that reduce both American and Chinese financial influence. This brings us to the core recognition that explains why both superpowers reacted with such urgency to what appeared to be a routine diplomatic speech. Freeland was not simply announcing Canadian policies. She was demonstrating that the binary structure of American-Chinese competition is no longer the organizing principle of international relations. For the past decade, most countries have assumed they would eventually be forced to choose between American and Chinese spheres of influence. The Canadian speech proved that choice is optional for nations with the right combination of resources, geography, and strategic patience. Canada has built the economic infrastructure to operate independently of both superpowers while maintaining beneficial relationships with both. The demonstration effect is what terrifies planners in Washington and Beijing. If Canada can achieve strategic independence, other middle powers will attempt similar strategies. Australia controls critical mineral supplies. Brazil dominates food production. Norway commands energy resources. Each of these nations is now studying Canadian methods for converting resource advantages into strategic autonomy. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese reportedly requested detailed briefings on Canadian Arctic policy within 2 weeks of Freeland's speech. Brazilian officials began exploring whether Amazon resource development could follow Canadian models for maintaining sovereignty while attracting international investment. Norwegian energy companies initiated discussions with Canadian counterparts about coordinating policies that would reduce dependence on both American and Chinese energy markets. The mathematics of superpower competition change completely when multiple middle powers possess genuine alternatives to alignment with either the United States or China. Instead of a bipolar system where smaller nations are forced to choose sides, the world evolves toward a multipolar structure where middle powers can leverage their advantages to maintain independence while playing larger powers against each other. This is the historical pattern that Freeland's speech made visible. The era of superpower dominance is ending not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the patient accumulation of alternatives that make dependence unnecessary. Countries that control essential resources and develop independent infrastructure can escape the gravity of superpower politics entirely. The American response revealed the extent of their strategic disadvantage. Within 2 weeks of the Canadian speech, American officials began offering unprecedented concessions in trade negotiations that had been stalled for months. Tariff threats that had been used to pressure Canadian compliance suddenly disappeared. American companies that had been relocated away from Canadian suppliers began reversing those decisions. The Department of Commerce quietly suspended several investigations into Canadian trade practices that had been proceeding for months. The Treasury Department began exploring mechanisms for incorporating Canadian materials currencies into American reserve portfolios, despite previous opposition to any alternatives to dollar dominance. The Chinese response was equally telling. Beijing started offering Canadian companies access to Chinese markets on terms that had been previously reserved for countries willing to explicitly support Chinese positions in international disputes. Chinese investment in Canadian infrastructure projects increased dramatically, with fewer political conditions attached than in previous arrangements. Chinese state-owned enterprises that had been prohibited from certain partnerships with Canadian companies suddenly received authorization to proceed with joint ventures that had been stalled by political considerations. The Bank of China began preliminary discussions about establishing specialized facilities for handling Canadian materials currency transactions. Both superpowers recognized that they were now competing for Canadian cooperation, rather than assuming Canadian dependence. This reversal of leverage changes everything about how international relationships function in North America and globally. The speech also revealed the sophistication of Canadian long-term planning. The policies announced by Freeland were not reactive responses to current international tensions. They were the culmination of strategic development that had been proceeding quietly for years while the world focused on more dramatic geopolitical events. Canadian infrastructure investments in Arctic development, critical mineral processing, and alternative trade routes had been building the foundation for strategic independence without announcing that intention. The agricultural diversification, energy export expansion, and financial system development that enabled Canadian monetary independence had been treated as routine economic development rather than geopolitical strategy. The timing of the announcement demonstrated exceptional strategic judgment. American domestic politics is increasingly focused on internal divisions that limit the government's ability to respond effectively to international challenges. Chinese economic growth is slowing due to demographic pressures and debt burdens that reduce Beijing's capacity for international expansion. Both superpowers are operating from positions of comparative weakness that create opportunities for middle powers to assert greater independence. Canada chose this moment to announce its strategic independence because neither superpower is currently capable of the sustained pressure that would be required to force Canadian compliance. The Americans cannot credibly threaten economic isolation of their largest trading partner during a period of domestic economic uncertainty. The Chinese cannot offer sufficient inducements to overcome Canadian suspicion of authoritarian political systems. The window for Canadian strategic assertion may not remain open indefinitely, but early indicators suggest it will last long enough for Canadian independence to become institutionalized through international agreements and economic relationships that would be difficult to reverse even if superpower capabilities recover. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how completely it escaped public attention. While global media focused on dramatic military conflicts and trade wars, Canada was quietly building the infrastructure of independence that makes those conflicts irrelevant to Canadian interests. The country that was supposed to be caught between competing superpowers had actually positioned itself to benefit from their competition while avoiding the costs of alignment with either side. Intelligence assessments from both American and Chinese sources, according to unconfirmed reports, now classify Canada as a strategic competitor rather than a subordinate ally or potential partner. This reclassification reflects the recognition that Canadian policies can no longer be predicted based on superpower preferences or pressure. The Pentagon's latest strategic review reportedly includes Canada in the category of nations whose policies must be negotiated rather than assumed. The Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy apparatus has begun treating Canada as a sovereign actor whose cooperation must be earned rather than expected. The institutional memory of both superpowers contains no precedent for this type of strategic reversal. Middle powers are not supposed to develop genuine alternatives to superpower alignment. The existing playbooks assume that economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or security guarantees will eventually force smaller nations back into dependent relationships. Canada has demonstrated that these assumptions no longer hold when a nation controls essential resources and builds patient strategic infrastructure. American strategic planners are reportedly struggling to develop responses to Canadian independence because their training and institutional experience assumes that allies will ultimately defer to American leadership when forced to choose. Canadian behavior violates these foundational assumptions about how international relationships function. The realization that Canada genuinely possesses alternatives has created what intelligence sources describe as analytical paralysis within key American strategic planning institutions. Chinese planners face a different but equally challenging problem. Beijing's approach to international relations assumes that economic inducements combined with infrastructure investment will eventually create dependency relationships that can be converted into political influence. The Canadian model demonstrates that resource-rich nations can accept Chinese investment while maintaining strategic autonomy and developing alternatives to Chinese supply chains. This threatens the fundamental logic of Chinese international expansion strategy. History does not announce its turning points. It embeds them in routine diplomatic speeches that reveal their significance only to those who understand how power actually moves between nations. The world thought this was about Canadian foreign policy. It was actually about the end of the age of superpowers and the beginning of something entirely different. The quiet country that everyone overlooked had been preparing for this moment while the giants were distracted by their own competition. According to early indicators from diplomatic assessments, other middle powers are already adapting Canadian strategies for their own circumstances. The model is spreading because it works, and because the conditions that made it possible are not unique to Canada. The speed of this adaptation reveals how prepared other nations were for alternatives to superpower dependence. South Korea quietly began exploring Arctic shipping partnerships within 3 weeks of Freeland's speech, despite having no previous involvement in polar logistics. The timing suggests that Seoul had been studying Canadian Arctic strategy for months before the UN announcement provided political cover for direct engagement. Mexico initiated discussions with Canadian officials about establishing a North American materials currency zone that would reduce dependence on US dollar transactions for regional trade. These conversations had been impossible, while Mexico remained locked into USMCA frameworks that assumed American economic leadership. The Canadian demonstration of strategic independence gave Mexico permission to explore alternatives that had been politically unthinkable. Singapore began developing port facilities specifically designed to handle Arctic shipping traffic, anticipating Canadian-controlled routes becoming central to Asia-Europe trade. The investment timeline indicates that Singaporean planners had been preparing for this possibility well before any public Canadian announcements about Arctic control. The convergence of timing reveals a level of international coordination that suggests Canadian strategy was more widely understood among strategic planners than publicly acknowledged. Each adaptation reinforces Canadian leverage while simultaneously weakening superpower control over international systems. The network effects create geometric rather than linear erosion of traditional power structures. By the time the full implications become obvious, the transformation will already be complete. This is not a prediction. It is an observation of processes that are already in motion and cannot be reversed through traditional superpower pressure. The 17 minutes that changed everything will be studied by future historians as the moment when the world quietly moved beyond the assumption that only military and economic giants can determine the structure of international relations. Canada proved that patient strategy and strategic resources can create options that make superpower pressure optional rather than determinative. Most people still think this was just another speech. History disagrees. The financial markets understand what political analysts missed. Canadian government bonds now trade at premiums that reflect not just fiscal stability, but strategic indispensability. Currency traders who ignored the September speech began repositioning their portfolios in November when early indicators showed central banks quietly diversifying reserves toward Canadian assets. The smart money moved while the commentary focused on traditional geopolitical theater. I watched the daily diplomatic cables, the closed-door strategy sessions, the emergency policy reviews that never make headlines. What I observe is the systematic recalibration of global power relationships around a new reality that most people have not yet recognized. Countries that spent decades calculating their positions based on American-Chinese competition are now factoring Canadian approval into their strategic planning. This is not diplomacy. This is the quiet mathematics of dependence shifting from one configuration to another. The 17 minutes have already accomplished what military campaigns and economic warfare could not. They created a world where the largest powers must compete for the cooperation of a nation they had taken for granted. The transformation required no explosions, no invasions, no dramatic confrontations. It required only the patient construction of alternatives and the strategic timing of their announcement.